everyone. Is this mic on? Great. Thank you so much for coming to the kitchen tonight. We are delighted to be welcoming back Douglas Crimp, who today will be reading from his new book, published by Dancing Foxes Press, called Before Pictures. Part autobiography, part cultural history, this book reviews Douglas's time in the 70s and covers a wide range of his experiences, but tonight he'll be reading from some sections detailing his experiences with dance in particular, both watching it, particularly the work of Cunningham, Balanchine, and the Grand Union, and also dancing himself in discos. So he'll be reading for a little bit, and then he'll be joined by dancers and choreographers Silas Reiner, Yvonne Rayner, and Adrian Danchig-Waring for a conversation. Afterwards, we'll do a brief question and answer session, and then books are available for sale out in the lobby, and Douglas will be signing them right here at the table. So thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the talk.
Thank you so much for coming. It's very good to be home. I've been traveling all around the country. And by home, I mean New York and also the kitchen, actually, where I feel very much at home. Yes, I was in Marfa, Texas, when catastrophe struck, so that was a bit alienating. As Katie said, I'm going to read a couple of brief passages from my book that have to do with dance. The first one is from a chapter called Disco, a Fragment, in which I exhume something that I started writing about disco in 1975 and publish it as a fragment and then frame it. So I'm not going to read the fragment, I'm going to read a bit of the framing. My project on disco, such as it was probably an attempt to work through my ambivalence about the new scene. I wasn't a member at Flamingo, which is the disco I describe. I didn't measure up to its standard of physical beauty, and I felt excluded by its cliquishness and conformity. But I was also attracted to some of the guys I thought did meet the standard, and I felt happy to be there when I found a member to go with. Most of all, I had always loved to dance, starting with fifth grade ballroom dance classes, intensifying during my junior high school years when I learned to jitterbug with my older sister's friends, intensifying still more when I easily picked up all the 1960s dance crazes from the twist to the Watusi to line dances like the Hully Gully, which would serve me well for learning the hustle during my disco days, and intensifying most of all when the music in the hands of the DJ seemed to make my body move as if by remote control and manipulate my mood in ever-increasing rushes of pleasure. Of course, this last phase of dance loving was enhanced by drugs, everything from acid to angel dust, a tranquilizer so powerful and spatially disorienting that it was wise while high on it to stay in one place on the dance floor. Drugs, always hard on me, were probably the main cause of my ambivalence. I'm one of those people made edgy and paranoid instead of mellow by pot. On an acid trip, I hallucinated being in the middle of a forest fire. Heroin made me throw up. Speed made me feel great for an hour and crash for 24. Once on Fire Island, a group of us took mescaline before going into the water to play in the surf, got caught in a current, and just barely saved ourselves from drowning. I was tripping on hallucinogenic mushrooms at a party in Los Angeles when the police raided it. I took way too many drugs during the late 60s and 70s. I took them alone, with friends and boyfriends, at parties, for sex, for the experience, but most of all, I took them for disco. You can't really give yourself over to serious discoing without drugs. You need the incredible level of energy they give the illusion of supplying, and you need their disinhibiting quality to allow the music's beat to take over your body, inhabit it, make it move with no sense of volition. Without drugs, disco can be fun, but just fun. I resisted disinhibition probably because I was trying to get serious about being an art critic right at the time that I became a disco bunny. I fought the effect of drugs. I thought at the disco. I thought, why are all of these grown-up men acting like excited children? Why do I like this so much? How will I feel about this tomorrow? Several years ago, I read a passage of the philosophy of Andy Warhol that resonated with my disco experience. It's not about drugs or dancing, it's about sex, but the analogy works perfectly. And I quote Warhol, "Some people can have sex and really let their minds go blank and fill up with the sex. Other people can never let their minds go blank and fill up with the sex. So while they're having the sex, they're thinking, can this really be me? Am I doing this? This is very strange. 5 minutes ago, I wasn't doing this. In a little while, I won't be doing it. What would Mom say? How did people ever think of doing this?" So the first type of person, the type that can let their minds go blank and fill up with sex and not think about it, is better off. The other type has to find something else to relax with and get lost in. I tried to resolve my disco ambivalence not by finding something else, but by changing venues. I stopped going to Flamingo and shifted my loyalty to 12 West, which was a bit A-list and a bit more diverse. Later, I occasionally went to the Paradise Garage, which was way more diverse. But by the time I started going to the Garage, I'd started graduate school and become the managing editor of October, and the demands of coursework and running a quarterly journal interfered with my disco routine. Eventually, I pretty much stopped going to the big, fabulous gay discos. I realized that in many ways, I preferred the grungy little gay bars that had dance floors, like Crisco Disco and the Cock Ring. I could go to at a more convenient hour any night of the week, never have to stand in line to get in, pay no admission, and still dance to music mixed by some of the best DJs spinning in New York. And unlike those real discos, the patrons of these places were into more than just dancing, which meant that my night often ended with one of them in my bed. Maybe I took Warhol's advice to find something else to relax with and get lost in after all. And then I want to read the final section of the penultimate chapter, which is called Agon, which is about my friendship with Craig Owens, the art critic Craig Owens, who sadly died of AIDS in 1990. And our parallel involvement with the choreography of George Balanchine and reading post-structuralist theory as graduate students at the CUNY Graduate Center. And some of this has to do with the fact that Craig was very much more conversant with post-structuralist theory than I was. And in fact, Craig had translated Jacques Derrida's The Père Agon for October. While thinking back to my introduction to Balanchine's work through my friendship with Craig, and returning to our simultaneous encounter with post-structuralist theory, I pulled my copy of Derrida's Of Grammatology off the shelf and opened it to the title page. There, handwritten, was the following: 4th ring, double A, low numbers, below 20. A note to myself, dictated by Craig, about which tickets to buy at the City Ballet box office. These are the seats that Craig and I nearly always sat in, the single row on the 4th ring side arms of the New York State Theater, as far back as possible away from the stage. They were inexpensive, which was essential, since we went to the ballet 3 or 4 times a week. The seats were numbered from the back to the front of the stage. Even numbers, stage right, odd numbers, stage left. They weren't available by subscription, so the sooner we got to the box office after single tickets went on sale, the more likely we were to get our preferred seats, which were fourth ring, AA 1 and 2 and 3, or 2 and 4. This means that my entire formative experience of Balanchine's ballets was from an oblique angle very high up. Many of Balanchine's works are best seen from the upper balconies of the theater, where the floor patterns and the resulting play of spatial volumes is more distinct, writes the Slavicist Timothy Scholl, for whom the architect quality is yet another of Balanchine's correspondences with the Russian poetic movement of Acmeism, which is the argument that Scholl is making in this piece that I quote. For me, and I think I can say this for Craig, this obliquity is what allowed us to reframe Balanchine, to release him from the neoclassical purity that would cordon him off from other interests, from our other interests at the time, among them what came to be called postmodern theory. Trying to imagine what Craig might have made of the current conjunction of dance and theory, and of the art world's enthusiastic embrace of dance, I return to the Agon. I have suggested that the lesson Craig drew from his engagement with Derrida was that we should attend to what aesthetic theory had heretofore excluded, the frame, which supposedly differentiates the intrinsic from the extrinsic in the work of art. Derrida asks, what if aesthetics is not about what is intrinsic and what is extrinsic to the work of art, but rather about the impossibility of distinguishing the two? What if we were to understand the frame not only as, and I quote Derrida, a detachable part, a separate part, but also a non-detachable part, a non-separate part, since it constitutes the articulation between two others? In other words, heeding Craig's call to turn our attention to the Agon, among those aspects of the frame to which we need to attend are its instability, the impossibility of locating it, fixing its place with regard to art's inside and outside. How might we apply this to Balanchine's ballets? According to Lynn Garafola, the strict hierarchies of the classical ballet during Marius Petipa's reign as ballet master, this is in the 19th century, of course, in Russia, and I quote Garafola, mirrored the hierarchy that governed all aspects of imperial life. Ranks determined the minimum and maximum number of dancers who could appear in a group. Choreophées could dance in groups of no more than 8. Second soloists in group of no more than 4. First dancers in groups of no more than 2. The ballerina danced alone. Thus, hierarchy was built into the very substance of choreography. It also went to the heart of ballet's social message. The corps de ballet occupies the lowest level of the hierarchy. Jill Johnston, a champion of postmodern dance who scorned ballet, wrote, and I quote her, "In ballet, the frame remains a frame. The corps de ballet is often seen to form a frame within a frame to make it clear that something is being framed, a frame-up." And Derrida says, in the Agon, the violence of framing proliferates. A modernist account of Balanchine generally focuses on his reduction of ballet to its essentials, his stripping away of storyline, sets, and costumes, such that ballet becomes nothing more than movement in relation to music. But such a reduction is inapplicable to most of his works. Moreover, a deconstructive approach reveals the uncertainty of its results. Scholl tells us, and I quote, Balanchine's black and white costumes are designed not to be noticed. But then he makes clear that they are precisely what is noticed. The sparse minimalist works, this is him again, of Balanchine's American period are known as black and white ballets. Even Serenade, the first ballet Balanchine made in America, suggests to Scholl that Balanchine's intention was the legibility of the body. Although after its premiere in 1935, Balanchine dressed it up rather than down. Simple tunics at that time became eventually romantic tutus. And I quote here again from Scholl. The skirts that Barbara Korinska, with Balanchine, developed for Serenade differ from their romantic models in two important ways. First, they are not as full as the traditional skirts. They are lighter and more motile. In performance, the skirt flies to a much greater extent than those typically worn in the 19th century, in accordance with the quicker tempi and invigorated choreography of Balanchine's romantic reverie. They are also more revealing. The front of the skirt contains a white panel of tulle that shows the workings of the legs more clearly. Thus, even in a work with obvious historical allusions, with costumes dictated more or less by tradition, the Balanchinian priorities are apparent. To me, what is most radical about Serenade is its dissolution of classical ballet hierarchy through the motility of not just the dancing body, but also the frame. Serenade is legendarily a ballet Balanchine made for students of the newly founded School of American Ballet. A ballet of patterns, a ballet of constant movement, a ballet to train an ensemble. In a sense, it is a ballet that is all corps de ballet. Occasionally, dancers do break free of the ensemble to dance solos, and over the years, Balanchine gave greater emphasis to 3 principal female roles and added a pas de deux. But owing to the ceaseless reconfiguration of the female corps in numbers, in space, no description of Serenade could securely fix its frame beyond noting its perpetual motion. I have seen the ballet scores of times, and I have trouble remembering at any given moment what will come next. Of course, not all of Balanchine's ballets do away with the hierarchies of classical ballet. Many, like Symphony in C, are made in the mold of Petipa. Even the ballet's rousing finale, however, calls attention to the frame, as the corps of 36 women lines the stage on either side and performs a series of quick, repetitive tendus. It's hard to look at anything else. Others of Balanchine's ballets, for example, Concerto Barocco, while maintaining the division between corps de ballet and principal dancers, give equivalent choreographic weight to each. And at least one of Balanchine's greatest ballets, Le Tombeau de Couperin, with music by Ravel, is made for the corps alone. I don't mean to suggest that the mobility of the frame and the attendant de-hierarchizing of choreography are the sole determinants of Balanchine's ballet modernism. Rather, I think they are the qualities that are most compatible with the simultaneity of Craig's and my Balanchine-driven balletomania and interest in post-structuralist theory. Although the latter led to our theorizing postmodernism, we first used it as committed modernists to show how certain photographs image the processes of the photographic medium. That's something that I talk about earlier in the chapter. And if the Agon shows us that aesthetics is not about what is intrinsic and what extrinsic to the work of art, but rather is about the impossibility of distinguishing between the two, then perhaps the imbrication of the modern in the postmodern and the postmodern in the modern was what we saw in Balanchine's ballets from the oblique angle in fourth ring seats AA 1 and 3 or 2 and 4. Thank you. And now I'd like to invite my friends Yvonne and Adrian and Silas to join me here. I don't know where, if it makes any difference where we sit. And I'll just say that I chose this particular ensemble because I do mention at moments in the book my first encounter with Cunningham, and of course Silas was one of the great dancers in the final company of Merce Cunningham. And with Yvonne, unfortunately a little late, but when Yvonne was making the transition to performance and film in This Is the Story of a Woman Who. And then Adrian, of course, because Adrian is a principal dancer with New York City Ballet and has danced, I think, all of the ballets that I mentioned in this chapter, particularly Agon, which is the title of the chapter and which I analyze in the beginning of the chapter. Actually, there's a wonderful picture of Adrian as Apollo in the book, and as Yvonne, and also of Yvonne. Unfortunately, Silas is not in the book. But so anyway, that's yeah, and also because all are good friends and dancers that I admire immensely, and choreographers as well.
Thank you.
So, would one of you like to get this conversation going?
Well, I just find it fascinating that two balletto mains, their only vantage point was oblique. When the Renaissance space of like Agon, I mean, it's symmetrical and has a vanishing point, and the classical theatrical space, suggesting an ideal vantage point, right?
Exactly.
It's the center in the auditorium or theater for the spectator. So you got a very, I mean, you acknowledge that, you got a very distorted, biased view of
Yes.
ballet, yeah. I don't know what I can add to that. It's just very, very curious.
Well, I have to say that Craig and I were also always extremely jealous of the fact that Lincoln Kirsten and Arlene Croce always sat first string center. Actually, they weren't at the very center. They were
Right on the aisle.
On the aisle, yeah. Because Kirsten was a very large man who probably needed, like me, a lot of extra leg room. But yeah.
But that just brings up that critics and reviewers often sit on the aisle so they can leave, right? So they also have a biased view.
Yeah, not as much as ours. But I do think, I think that it's not entirely wrong to, although, yes, Balanchine, many of his ballets, as I said, of Symphony in C, have that ideal vantage point that comes from Petipa and Russian classicism, but others, I think, are much more fluid in their use of stage space. I mean, they're certainly not treating the stage as a field as Cunningham did, but I do think that it pays to see them sometimes from an angle, and to see how the choreography works. And it works, I think, equally well, actually, in many cases.
I will say, to use Yvonne's word, I feel like I've only had distorted perspectives on these ballets from various vantage points within them or from the wings. And when I do watch from the house, it's often from the back of the first ring side.
Interesting.
Sort of like company standing room. So there are different vantage points that illuminate the constructions in different ways.
But I mean, during a rehearsal, do you sometimes sit in the ideal seats in the middle of the house? No?
Depends on what the rehearsal is pursuing. If it's technical and it's construction, we're not permitted to sit in the center of the house because the lighting table is there.
Okay.
So I guess it is always oblique for us as well.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that, you know, also what I was doing, Yvonne, of course, is trying very much to go back to this moment when it, you know, at the time it didn't occur to me that there was any kind of relation between our balletomania and our in our post-structuralist theory education. But now it seems impossible that because we were so deep into both at exactly the same time, that one wouldn't have somehow infested the other.
I'm still full. I'm sorry if this may be a tangent, but I was just in LA, arrived back last night from improvising with Steve Paxton and Simone Forti, and one of the contributions of Paxton were these frames of different sizes, one about 5 feet high, 3 feet, and a much smaller one. And one of the functions of the frames, which we were, all three of us used, was to take these frames and
frame each other.
During someone else's improvisation, put it on the feet or the head or the. So the idea of framing, of course, is a very interesting one. Still, what you see, what you call attention to.
And then with Cunningham, of course, Cunningham kind of resolutely refused in many cases to frame. So as an audience member, one has to choose whether you're going to look at this dancer or that dancer.
Right.
The choreography doesn't give you that.
Well, it gives it and it takes it away. I feel like Merce maintained certain aspects of a kind of classical vocabulary. There's often, an important time in the dance when there's only one man and one woman on the stage, and they do something amazing or special. And then there is a lot more of the kind of democratization of space that you're talking about, where there's a lot of different things to choose to look at. So I feel like he kind of had a foot in each frame, maybe. Well, there are some classical roots still to the work, but he was sort of obliterating things as he went.
Well, and of course, there's a difference, I think, between the repertory works and the events. And because I wrote about the events, that has that determined, not in this book, but in much later, recently, because the final events. Not the very final ones, but yes, the very final events actually dispersed the dancing across several stages,
right.
And you could not, there was no vantage point, certainly at Dia Beacon, where you could see all of the stages at once, and you had to make a choice.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I think he was making it hard for you.
Indeed, indeed. Yes.
And maybe that's the difference between the understanding of Balanchine as a modernist and the modern choreographers that were working at the same time. There was certainly influence that was going in both directions, but also some sort of deep disagreements about what they were representing about dance and the body.
I think it's interesting, though, that kind of construction requires agency, right, in its audience. You are making these active choices, and that breeds a certain kind of bias where everyone is having this particular experience, which isn't specific from the choreographic perspective. It's not intrinsic to that structure.
Right. So, the way I write about that is that it is about partiality, the partiality of one as a subject, as a viewing subject, which is both the fact that one can only see what one can see from one's vantage point, but also that will then be a kind of partial, in a sense, of biased view. Yeah.
Right. I know from a personal perspective, my vantage point in Serenade is usually largely obstructed by hair.
Not your.
Not mine.
Not your own.
No. Yours.
Right. If you were on stage with me.
It happens. You're talking about the idea of subjectivity, I guess, from the perspective of the artist, that each audience member would have their own subjective experience regardless of the artists choosing how we are all sitting and what we're all facing or what we're all looking at. I don't feel like you can get away from that even when you are. Even listening to Douglas talk about the slant view that he had.
Because the proscenium does what it's designed to do.
Yeah, sure, of course. Yeah. And then, of course, you and your generation were working in a place that didn't have a frame because it was a church sanctuary, and so it wasn't a proscenium, and that had an enormous impact on the development of dance. So now we can have dances, as we do very much these days in museums that certainly don't have proscenium spaces.
Well, that's another problem.
That's another problem. Yeah. So, not one that I deal with in the 1960s. Yeah.
Right.
In the 70s.
Although you might have, we danced in museums in the early 70s.
I know,
right?
and
Or
I
late
just,
60s.
sadly wasn't there at the right time. It was, as I say, in relation to something else in my book, those were my disco days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you have framed the experience of reading the book through the different apartments that you live in, which I resonated very, very deeply with me as a person who missed the New York where you got to live in a huge loft apartment on Mercer or any number of different places, and that at least people moving to New York more now, it's one of extreme periphery.
Right.
But it has sort of framed my experience of living here too, the apartments that I lived in and what my commute was. And so that was a really sort of sweet way to understand your time.
Yeah, that's something that came about sort of by chance. When I was organizing the table of contents of the book, I just happened to write in just to sort of orient myself where I was living when what took place in those particular chapters, what took place when I was living in those places, and then I sent that to my editors, Karen Kelly and Barbara Schroeder, and they liked that idea, and we talked about getting photographs of the various places that I had lived, and eventually I hit upon the idea of asking Zoe Leonard to make these amazing photographs, and she then, when I gave her a tour of the 5 buildings, we were taking the subway, and she hit upon the idea of also including the nearby subway stops, and that gave a wonderful through structure to the book. I had already decided to use the Massimo Vignelli designed 1972 subway map, which I'd always loved, and Joseph Logan, my designer, used it as the end papers of the book. And so, it came rather late in the process, but I love the fact that it gives Joseph noticed that I always moved downtown. I started in Spanish Harlem, and then I went to Chelsea and the Village and Tribeca and finally the Financial District. And so it gave this geographic movement through the chapters of the book as well as the chronological one. So, yeah. And of course, Zoe's photographs are so extraordinary and a real gift to the book.
What makes it a fascinating read for me is what I call the 9 lives aspect of it. I just made a list of from Watergate to the Piers to sexual escapades, dance, to fashion, criticism, scholarship. It's pretty impressive. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, it's one of the things that that came about in the process of writing and over time. But I did quite early on make a decision that I wanted to include autobiographical material with a kind of practice of criticism. And because I didn't have much in the way of an archive, and I hadn't saved a lot of, I never kept journals, unlike you, Yvonne, who had wonderful amounts of letters and journals and so on with which to write your terrific memoir.
Before computers,
Yeah.
email.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I mean, this was that too, but I had little space and I purged my files, much to my regret. Anyway, I ended up doing also a lot of research for this book.
Right.
So the Watergate section is an example of that. In 1973, it was my first summer on Fire Island, coincided with the Senate Watergate hearings, and I was in a community called Water Island that had no electricity, so I spent days on the beach with a transistor radio glued to my ear, like completely in the thrall of these hearings. And I thought I would tell that, just mention it in the book, but then I started researching it, and I got really far into it. And I wrote this, what turns out to be a pretty long section, and wondered if it belonged in the book. And then I read John Dean's memoir, in which he talks about a group of these buttoned-up Nixonites in the basement of the East Wing watching the Cockettes film of Trisha's wedding.
Right.
And I thought, okay, this is enough reason, and there are 3 great film stills from the Cockettes film that make it totally worthwhile. And then it turns out, very sadly, that the Watergate story and the story of a criminal president has become relevant. More relevant than I thought. I mean, I thought even when I was reading it that it was relevant because the Watergate break-in came about because of the passage of the first American campaign finance law. But yes, it was part of the pleasure of writing this book that I got to move through all of these different aspects of what was going on in my life in the late 60s and early 70s.
I have a question. I just want to find a place to begin it.
Okay.
So I'm thinking of the kind of piggybacking on Yvonne's question or observation of your 9 lives. There's this constant tension in the book, I think, between what I read as Apollonian and Dionysian indulgences. And early on in your New York life, you have this sort of great accomplishment, staging this Agnes Martin show at the School of Visual Arts. And you tell this kind of crazy narrative of going out to meet her at her house in the Mesa, getting lost, etc. But there's a quote here from her that I think, as I was reading, I kept referring back to because it felt like it sort of set this basso profundo in a way. And I mean, I know it's not my reading and they're not my words, but I'd just like to read this and maybe ask you to respond to it.
Please.
Classicism is not about people, and this work is not about the world. To a detached person, the complication of the involved life is like chaos. If you don't like the chaos, you're a classicist. If you like it, you're a romanticist. Someone said all human emotion is an idea. Painting is not about ideas or personal emotion. When I was painting in New York, I was not so clear about that. Now I am very clear that the object is freedom. These paintings are about freedom from the cares of this world, from worldliness.
Yeah, that's that. She goes on to say, or it says it at some point in this long kind of prose poem description of her work, that a classicist turns her back to the turmoil. And I titled that chapter, Back to the Turmoil. And I meant that in both ways. She had her back to the turmoil, and after visiting her, I went back to the turmoil. I couldn't wait to get back to the turmoil, I guess. But also, I think that this notion that one can entirely escape the turmoil of life is a kind of fantasy because, of course, the unconscious is always, our subjectivities are constituted through that turmoil. And of course, Martin had a great deal of turmoil in her life. She had psychological difficulties. And probably her only way of fully coming, to grips with those difficulties was to live in this extraordinary isolation that I saw when I visited her on the top of this mesa, literally in the middle of nowhere in New Mexico. And, and also to dedicate herself absolutely thoroughly to making these, for her, always imperfect paintings, but paintings that would get as near to perfection as they possibly could. And it's true, you're right. I mean, those are probably the paintings I love best in the world. I'm very much drawn to that kind of classicism. I'm certainly drawn to the classicism of certain of Balanchine's ballets. But I make the argument in the Balanchine chapter that to simply limit him to a kind of Apollonian is to, I think, distort his legacy, because I think that, he was equally a romantic, and also he had influences from all over the place. Mm-hmm. And I try to make that clear also in the chapter on Balanchine, where I talk about La Valse, which is a quintessentially romantic ballet where there's a figure of death that dances the ballerina to death. And I sort of relate that to, I relate the figure of death reclothing the ballerina who's clothed in white in black, as and the descriptions of Tanaquil Leclerc initially dancing the part, as she fully follows the figure of death with a kind of great avidity. I relate that to my sort of trips uptown after the ballet to go to the Candle Bar, which was a bar with a very active back room, and that sort of, the kind of dark side of the sexuality that was so much a part of my life, and the kind of explosion of the gay sexual culture post-Stonewall, and through the period of gay liberation that I wanted fundamentally to explore in this book.
I'm thinking, there's this Balanchine quote, and I'm probably going to reiterate it incorrectly, but I'm really interested in this distinction between the romantic output and the sort of neoclassical output, the sort of modernist works. And yet there's this Balanchine quote when he talks about, you don't need costumes and Baroque trappings and scenic elements. All you need is a man and a woman on stage. This is so heteronormative.
Of course.
You put a man and a woman on stage and you have a story. You put a man and two women on stage and you have plot.
Right.
What about two men?
Well, that's not the same. That's Jerome Robbins.
Oh,
Yeah.
Politics.
But was that difficult? In these sort of 3 or 4 ballet performances a week, was that a difficulty for you to see these sort of constantly heteronormative relationships?
I don't think so, because I think I just took it as convention. A convention that didn't, I had my attractions to particular male dancers, but my focus was honestly, for the most part, on Suzanne Farrell. Like a lot of gay men, I'm attracted to female opera singers and female ballet dancers. I'm more interested in what, maybe because ballet, as Balanchine famously said, is woman. After Taglioni went up on point, ballet became woman, and ballet became much more about the focus on women. And I accepted that as the convention of watching ballet, I think. At the same time, I also say in my kind of discussion of the kind of condemnation of balletomania as being interested in dancers rather than choreography, that I don't think you can make that distinction. That doesn't seem tenable to me. So for me, there wasn't really a contradiction in loving the complexity, the aesthetic complexity of the choreographic work and the particular bodies of the dancers dancing that work.
No argument here. There's a little bit earlier from the section that you read from in Agon, there's a part where your friend Craig is talking about Derrida again, and he quotes, where is it? He argues that every aesthetic theory from Plato to Heidegger has been a semiotic theory, a subordination of art to language, which for me is interesting to think about as a practitioner of a non-language art, and I suspect interesting for you because you're someone who has like greatly appreciated dancing and choreography, but also write about it, and that's been like your main lens with which to understand, explain, digest the work, which to me sort of maintains that distinction of language being somewhat in a hierarchy with the art itself.
Yeah, I think that's true to some degree, although I think that, you know, what Derrida is writing about is aesthetic theory or aesthetic philosophy more than criticism, and I make some kind of a distinction between those two. I think that criticism often is in a kind of dialogue with aesthetic practices. That at least has been my experience very often. I certainly, on the one hand, am grappling with my own experience of work through language, because that's how I try to puzzle out the challenge of a work. With dance, that becomes enormously harder, because describing movement, turning movement into prose is an extremely difficult thing to do. And of course, it's an impossible thing to do. You can only make you can make it as vivid as you can, but it doesn't in any sense replace it. But in the process, often I think of talking about visual art and using description there as well, a certain kind of theory emerges, and that theory sometimes is something that I think appears in criticism in a way that it has not necessarily been entirely conscious on the part of the artist. Right. And I'm sure that takes place in relation between critical writing about dance and choreographic practice as well. Because artists, like everyone else, are unconscious. We never have entire control over what we're doing. So I'm assuming that a good writer can bring out an aspect of what you yourself might produce that will be a revelation even to you. I hope that.
Yeah,
would
I
be
hope
the
so.
case. Yeah.
I'm thinking there's always a kind of irony or contradiction that dance is abstract and yet it's physical at the same time. The body is always there, the genders are always there, and yet it has a language. The ballet language is creates this kind of abstraction, and that's what makes it so hard to articulate in verbal language. And,
I mean, the same could be said, Yvonne, I think, though, for abstract painting.
yeah,
It's terribly difficult to grapple with a Robert Ryman painting or an Agnes Martin painting.
Yeah.
And I talk about here, my early attempts to deal with Martin that were so absurd because I was reducing her to a kind of mathematics. And of course, that's not what we experience when we experience her painting, because we are moved by her painting. And I at least am not moved by mathematics. I suppose some mathematicians are, but or abstract languages, I suppose, can be indeed moving.
Well, you said a couple minutes ago, Martin was always kind of pursuing this personally held idea of perfection, right, which was her form. Those were those 6-foot square canvases. And I think my understanding of the origins of ballet as a vocabulary, using the body in all its flaws, was in the pursuit of a similarly impossible idea of perfection. It was this sort of Enlightenment notion of making ourselves better through mathematics, in a way, physicalized mathematics, but in the great chain of being, attaining elevation, being closer to the angels and thus closer to God, right? Pulling ourselves up out of the muck.
And there's actual mathematics in 19th century ballet, or even 18th century ballet. Noverre talks about the idea that, you know, you have this kind of doubling of perspective in the stage sets, where you actually, you know, increase the sense of depth by drawing perspective in the sets. But then he also suggested that you have the shorter dancers in the back and the taller ones in front to have an actual perspective on stage as well. So, yeah. Should we open up and see if there are any questions in the house? This is being live streamed, so someone will appear with a microphone so that you can actually ask the question that can then be picked up by the live stream as well.
Oh, nice lighting change.
Thank you so much to all of you. Douglas, I think that your book offers a couple of answers to this question, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how the tools of art history specifically can continue to serve the study of dance and ballet in ways that performance studies or dance history can't.
Sorry, you'll have to repeat that a little bit louder. I didn't get the end of it.
I wondered if you could talk about how the tools of art history as a discipline can continue to serve the study of dance and performance in ways that disciplines like performance studies or dance history can't.
Well, you know, I think that art history is a discipline, as we understand it, something that has existed in the academy for a much longer time than dance studies. Dance studies as a separate field, separate that is from theater studies, is almost brand new. And I think that dance studies work is you know, finding itself at this point. So far, I have found some of the work that's done by art historians on dance to be, such as Carrie Lambert Beatty's book on Agon, to be among the more satisfying works in the field. But there's also a kind of departure, I think, so that I think that the way that dance studies is establishing itself in the academy is that it is becoming more and more interested in non-Western dance, in non-canonical dance, in forms of dance that have been marginalized in history. And thus far, art historians are not so much participating in that non-canonical dimension. So I think that, you know, the two disciplines are actually working in tandem and in good ways. I feel sort of caught in the middle of it. I have one PhD who actually now she did a dissertation on Tricia Brown and Lucinda Childs, and now is really in the field of dance studies. And I learned from her a lot about that field. Yeah.
Hi. So you talked about the ways in which the hierarchies of the neoclassicism departed from classical sphere. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what the asymmetry of the hierarchies between the neoclassicism and postmodernism in dance happen socially, particularly because ballet and the world of ballet is such a level of division between class. And maybe, Yvonne, I'm particularly interested in what you think about this asymmetry between the neoclassic world and the postmodern world, particularly in the way of who gets to make the dances. In other words, we think of ballet, we think of Balanchine, Jerome Robbins. They're all men who are actually making the dances. And it seems that the two of you were talking about how you didn't really differentiate that much your engagement in both the ballet world and the postmodern world. But in terms of gender, what was going through your mind in terms of who really got to own choreography in that respect?
Who are you addressing here?
Me, I'm assuming.
Well, as a choreographer,
any of us, I guess, yeah.
And as a woman, I'm interested in hearing what your sense of that kind of division is in terms of, the hierarchies and symmetries of the post, neoclassic world and postmodernism.
Well, of course, the postmodernism that I was talking about in this chapter was postmodernism in the visual arts, because I wasn't really, Craig was, there's one instance which I quoted in the book where Craig was looking at one of the second proscenium work by Tricia Brown. And he was somewhat critical of Tricia's Son of Gone Fishin' for not deconstructing the frame in the way that she had with Glacial Decoy, her first proscenium work. Of course, it's true that not only postmodern, but modern dance is most of the great, dominated for sure, starting from the very beginning with Isadora Duncan, Ruth St. Denis, Loie Fuller, and on and on and on. Then it goes through, Doris Humphrey and Martha Graham. The great figures of modern dance are, I would say most of them, the majority of them are women. So I think that is, from my perspective, I don't know if you would agree, Yvonne, but that's built into that is a kind of implicit, if not explicit, critique of the world, of the institutionalized world of ballet, as these women in the late 19th, in the case of Loie Fuller, and early 20th century, were facing it. They made they did so many things that disrupted that institution, but gender was primary.
But I'd like to point out that I can speak for myself and for Simone, who was an abstract expressionist painter before she became a dancer, that the dance world has always been more welcoming of women, or the modern dance and postmodern dance. It's not the case in ballet. But outside of ballet, the dance world has been more welcoming of women as creators and practitioners of the form, of whatever.
I was just thinking about Cunningham as a very major modern postmodern choreographer, but also broke down gender distinctions, at least in dressing his male and female dancers the same way, and tended to give them, apart from the pas de deux, equivalent things to do in his, more or less equivalent things to do in his choreography.
I don't know if I fully agree with you about
But
that.
the partnering was always
it was
gendered.
always really pretty gendered. And,
Yes.
Merce
and
coming
even
behind a female, and
Including Merce himself with Carolyn Brown, and absolutely.
And I think that I don't know if that was like a shrewd move on his part of like, this is still something that people really need, or this is what I think I'm supposed to give them in terms of like my work, but it always stayed. And even like when there would be a group of women, they would often would have like a very slow or like delicate kind of movement, and the men would be running around, jumping up and down. So I do think that there are some gendered areas that, certainly not all the time. He did a lot of different things. But
It was a very important point of departure in my early work, my 60s work. How many people does it take how many women does it take to lift a man? You know? And the body as something that can be manipulated beyond gender stereotypes. And,
but then there's also the question of the enormous institutional difference between ballet companies, which are often very long established, like the Paris Opera Ballet or the Mariinsky Ballet, which go back to the 19th century, the Danish Royal Ballet. They are actually imperial or royal companies, often. And then the modernity of modern dance. And still there are, enormous differences of pay scale and that sort of thing in the dance world. But there are actually larger differences between what is what the sort of monetary support of visual arts through collecting and buying is compared with the support for dance, which remains absolutely minimal.
It's not a commodity
You can't,
situation.
well, you can't put it on the wall.
No, you can't.
Right.
And arguably can't own it.
Yeah. Well, actually, some dances have recently been sold to museums.
Like performance rights?
Yes, and with performance contracts with who can teach it and who can perform it and what the pay scales will be of the dancers who perform it. And I mean, there's the case of Gerard and Kelly, who sold timelining to the Guggenheim Museum. There's someone over.
Thank you all so much. This has been so interesting. One thing that I think is really important about the book.
I can't quite hear.
One thing that I think is really important about the book in general and very makes it very meaningful to me personally is the way that you really insist on and demonstrate how intellectual interests, history, school, how these things are really meaningfully in dialogue with very personal things, whether that's ballet or disco or sex. And also for me as someone for whom the 70s is a historical period and not something I lived through, that's something that I see as part of the legacy of that period. So actually, if I may, I'd like to take this opportunity to ask Yvonne if she could maybe speak to a moment or some moments for her that follow that paradigm of understanding that two things that may not have seemed connected actually were part of the same project.
Let's see the last part of that. I didn't quite follow it.
I'm interested in moments when work, something that seems that has the frame of work around it, let's say, maybe dissolves into the frame of, well, if I say work dissolving into the frame of life, that sounds like I'm talking about the 70s in general. But a moment when maybe something that you were doing personally or sort of separate from other activities became comprehensible to you as part of work that you were doing, in a sense.
Well, I have such a disruptive history. I danced, then I didn't dance, and then I choreographed, and then I made movies. I feel a little constipated right now because I've just come from this extraordinary experience. My work since 2000 has been where it involved my own presence. I read. I love to exist in front of an audience. I love to just be there, and as I moved less and less, with my current work, I may crawl on all fours, but I leave the dancing to the dancers who are younger, but they're getting older. I mean, the oldest is 70, the youngest is 43?
Two.
Okay. Okay, so I got this invitation from Simone Forti, who lives in California, and Steve Paxton, who lives in northern Vermont, to come out there and do something in her gallery, which is this huge, there's some kind of, previously a factory, it was a cement floor, and in 2 days, the three of us worked up a performance. Now, they're very used to improvisation. This has nothing to do with the book. I mean, we're getting off.
No, it has to do with you, which is...
Yeah. So, I have not danced since 1972 in public, you know. And I danced. I'm feeling it now. It affects the way I speak. I'm kind of under the weather physically, but the three of us came up with speaking, conversing with each other, reading. I brought all the things that the texts I use in my current work, pasted them on the wall. We had these buckets that were inspired. I brought a video, and at the end of the video, the dancers lift Pat Catterson and go screaming across the space and dump her in a barrel. And she reads something, and the lights fade out, and that's the end of the dance. So we found these big, buckets, heavy plastic buckets, and you could sit down in it with your legs hanging out the side, and we I put envelope, taped an envelope with some text, so while you were in this bucket, you could take it out, and these texts had to do with fascism and politics and jokes, and we just managed for an hour to carry on. They're both, Steve is like a Buster Keaton foil. He doesn't move around much, but I was describing to one of you, describing to you this, he supplied these frames, and he brought a costume, which first was rolled up and tied around his head. And one of the things Simone had said she wanted to learn my Trio A, and Simone I don't think she's had a technique class in her whole life. But she makes images with her body. And whatever is at hand. I mean, she's quite extraordinary. I can't go on like this.
No, you should go on.
I'm sorry, I just came back midnight last night from this extraordinary experience. So Steve had this, she wanted to learn Trio A. So she can't straighten her legs. She doesn't know where her weight is. I mean, she dances, but not in any way that anyone with training, including me, has ever danced. So I'm teaching Trio A to Simone, and all of a sudden I noticed Steve, he's joined, but he has taken this thing off his head, and it's an apron with a male nude body photograph on it, genitalia and everything. And he's doing Trio A while she... So that's the kind of radical juxtapositions that went on during this performance. I mean, there were duets and solos, and I was blown away. I mean, these two people who I love, and we have 50, 40 years experience with each other, and we talked about that more. Yeah, it came up. Steve, years ago, shall I go on?
Yes, you should.
I hadn't intended to do this. I'm upstaging you.
No, please. I want to be upstaged. That's why I invited you, Yvonne.
Okay, so Steve and I have a history of something called, let's do it, I'll teach you it. Yeah. It's called arm drop.
Am I giving you weight?
Let's go away from here. Give your forearms the weight. No. Don't press.
Okay.
I'm supporting the actual weight
of my forearms.
Of your forearms. Yeah. Now, I'm going to let go, and you get mine. But you drop your arms to your side, and but let them just go.
Oh, and I'm not going to catch your arms?
You are going to catch my arms, but you're going to... Let's keep doing it. We'll find out. But you come up and get my arms. Now I'll try and... I have trouble with... Yeah, you feel my weight when you feel my weight. Yeah. Yes, and now drop them on. Yeah? So, yeah. Right. Well, around 1968, Steve came to my loft, and I made dinner, and we were stoned. We got stoned. And we started to fool around. We invented this form. He teaches it still. And we call it arm drop. So we started to do that in the performance. He came over to me, and I had just before the first performance, I remembered it, and I reminded him of it. Okay, at some point in the show, we'll do it. And as we're doing it, he starts articulating, remembering, yeah, you made the chicken, and I said, I'm quoting him, I said to you, what's in that chicken? And you said chicken. And, when you're stoned, this kind of thing is very funny. And meanwhile, we're doing arm drop, right, in the performance. And I started to cry. I mean, I just started to cry. There must be a name for this kind of body-mind memory configuration. It just came together like that. So there was this, what I'm describing is a range, the most extraordinary, for me, for them, maybe it wasn't that extraordinary, but I remember I had not moved, and I moved around, and I ran around, and which I haven't done for so long, and so that's my story.
It's a fantastic. I think we should end on that note. And, I'm going to sit here at this table if anyone would like me to sign a book, and I want to thank all of you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
So
I'll
how's
take
your
some,
body?
but you don't have to-
How's your
Well, I
body
do
after
it now.
that?
I mean,
And the flight back.
I don't know. I feel weird.
Yes,
you know?
altered.
Yeah. I mean, it's partly a